In the pristine streets of Pine Grove, where manicured lawns meet colonial facades, a restored 1967 Chevy Impala gleams under streetlights. For Marcus Johnson, it's more than just a car. It's his father's legacy, a labor of love 3 years in the making. But on this quiet evening, flashing police lights will transform his prized possession into something else entirely, a catalyst for change that no one saw coming. And drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his restored 1967 Chevrolet Impala, humming along to John Coltrane's A Love Supreme, playing softly through the speakers. The glossy black paint job gleamed under the streetlights of Pine Grove, a suburban neighborhood where perfectly manicured lawns stretched out before colonial-style homes. He'd spent 3 years restoring this car, a labor of love that connected him to his late father, who had taught him everything about classic cars before passing away. At 32, Marcus had finally achieved what his parents had always dreamed for him: a successful career as an architectural engineer, a beautiful home in a safe neighborhood, and the ability to pursue his passions. The Impala represented more than just a car. It was a bridge between his past and present, a symbol of everything he'd worked for. The night was quiet, the kind of peaceful evening that made Pine Grove's high property taxes seem worth it. Marcus had just finished a late meeting with clients and was looking forward to getting home to his wife, Sarah, who was probably already asleep. Their second anniversary was coming up, and he'd been planning a surprise weekend getaway. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror interrupted his thoughts. Marcus checked his speed. He was going exactly the limit. His registration and insurance were up to date, and he hadn't made any traffic violations. Still, he knew the drill. Taking a deep breath, he pulled over, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Officer James Walsh had been with the Pine Grove Police Department for 8 years. At 34, he considered himself one of the more progressive officers on the force, priding himself on being colorblind and treating everyone equally. He'd received multiple commendations for his work in community outreach, though his efforts mainly involved the more affluent parts of town. As Walsh approached the Impala, his flashlight beams swept across the vehicle. The car had caught his attention earlier. It matched the description of a stolen vehicle reported 2 counties over. The fact that it was being driven through Pine Grove at this hour by a black man only heightened his suspicions. "License and registration," Walsh demanded, his flashlight beam directly in Marcus's face. "Good evening, officer," Marcus replied calmly, his hand still on the wheel. "My registration is in the glove compartment, and my wallet is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's all right." Walsh nodded curtly, his hand resting on his holster. As Marcus carefully retrieved his documents, he noticed 2 more patrol cars pulling up behind them. His heart rate quickened, but he maintained his composed demeanor. "Step out of the vehicle," Walsh ordered after glancing at the documents. "May I ask why, officer?" "This vehicle matches the description of a stolen car. Step out slowly with your hands where I can see them." Marcus complied, his mind racing. He had every piece of documentation proving his ownership: the title, restoration receipts, insurance, even photos of the restoration process on his phone. But as additional officers approached, their hands on their weapons, he knew this situation was escalating beyond reason. Detective Sarah Johnson was working late at her desk in the Major Crimes Unit when the call came in. She wasn't assigned to patrol, but she always kept an ear on the radio chatter. When she heard the location and the description of a 1967 Impala, her blood ran cold. She knew exactly whose car that was. Meanwhile, a small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk. Among them was Dr. Eleanor Richards, a sociology professor at the local university who specialized in racial bias in law enforcement. She'd moved to Pine Grove 6 months ago and had been documenting instances of racial profiling in this supposedly progressive community. She pulled out her phone and began recording. Thomas Chen, a first-generation American who owned the corner store Marcus frequented, emerged from his shop with his teenage daughter, Jenny. They both recognized Marcus immediately. He stopped by almost every morning for coffee and often helped Jenny with her math homework. "That's Mr. Johnson," Jenny exclaimed. "He's not stealing anything. He restored that car himself." Walsh had Marcus standing spread eagle against the car while he radioed in the vehicle's information. 2 other officers, Rodriguez and Peterson, maintained a perimeter, keeping the growing crowd at bay. Rodriguez, a rookie officer, shifted uncomfortably as he watched the scene unfold. Something didn't feel right about this. Across the street, Richard Foster, the local news station's veteran cameraman, was returning from covering a city council meeting when he noticed the commotion. He'd been in the business long enough to recognize when a situation had the potential to become newsworthy. He quietly set up his equipment and began filming. Marcus's mind wandered to his father as he stood there, face pressed against the cold metal of his car. How many times had his dad warned him about this very situation? "It doesn't matter what you achieve," he'd said. "Some people will only ever see one thing." Marcus had wanted to believe times had changed, that his education, career, and choice of neighborhood would shield him from such assumptions. Now, the weight of his father's words pressed against him harder than Officer Walsh's hand on his back. In the distance, Sarah Johnson's unmarked police vehicle turned onto the street, lights flashing but sirens silent. She had worked her way up to detective through years of dedication and had earned the respect of most of her colleagues. But tonight, she wasn't sure if her badge would be enough to prevent a terrible mistake. Professor Richards continued recording as she pulled up property records and vehicle registration information on her phone. She'd seen this scenario play out too many times before, but something felt different about tonight. The growing crowd, the media presence, the mix of people gathering, it was as if Pine Grove's carefully maintained veneer of progressiveness was about to crack, revealing the prejudices that had always lurked beneath the surface. Jenny Chen had run back into her father's store and emerged with a thick photo album. Her father had insisted that Marcus share photos of his restoration project, displaying them proudly in the store like a proud parent. She tried to push forward through the crowd, but Officer Peterson blocked her path. Walsh was growing increasingly frustrated as dispatch took longer than usual to respond to his inquiry about the stolen vehicle report. Something about the situation wasn't adding up. The car was immaculate. The documentation seemed legitimate, and the suspect was being almost unnaturally cooperative. Still, he'd made the call, and now his pride was on the line. Rodriguez watched the crowd growing larger and more restless. He recognized faces from his community outreach programs: doctors, teachers, business owners. These weren't the usual spectators at a traffic stop. They were pillars of the community, and they were all watching with expressions that ranged from concern to outright anger. Richard Foster's camera captured every detail: the tight line of Walsh's jaw, the dignified stillness of Marcus against the car, the growing crowd of witnesses representing every demographic of Pine Grove's population. The veteran cameraman had covered everything from natural disasters to political scandals, but he sensed that this moment might be more significant than any breaking news story. Sarah Johnson was now 3 blocks away, her mind racing through protocols and procedures. As both a detective and a wife, she knew she would have to handle this situation delicately. One wrong move could escalate things beyond repair, not just for tonight, but for the entire community. Professor Richards had started a live stream of the incident, and viewers were quickly multiplying. Comments and shares were spreading across social media platforms, drawing attention from civil rights organizations and news outlets. Pine Grove's moment of reckoning was being broadcast in real time. Thomas Chen thought about all the mornings Marcus had spent in his store, sharing stories about his father and the car while helping Jenny with her calculus. He thought about his own journey as an immigrant, the subtle and not-so-subtle prejudices he'd faced, and the careful balance he'd maintained between speaking up and staying safe. Tonight, he decided, was a time for speaking up. The tension in the air was building, thick and heavy, like the humidity before a storm. Every person present sensed that they were witnessing something larger than a simple traffic stop. This was a moment that would force their community to confront the biases they had all pretended didn't exist in their progressive suburb. Marcus remained still, his cheek against the cool metal of his father's car, waiting. In his mind, he could hear his father's voice mixing with Coltrane's saxophone, both carrying the same message about patience, dignity, and the long arc of justice. He knew that whatever happened next would ripple far beyond this street corner in Pine Grove. But for now, all he could do was wait, breathe, and hold on to his father's lessons about maintaining dignity in the face of injustice. The crowd continued to grow, and with it, the weight of watching eyes. Each person present carried their own story, their own biases, their own hopes for how this situation would resolve. As Sarah Johnson's car turned the final corner, The collective tension reached a crescendo, but the night's true revelation was still to come. Sarah Johnson's unmarked car pulled up to the scene with practiced precision. She stepped out, her badge visible on her belt, her movements measured and deliberate. The crowd parted instinctively, recognizing authority in her stance. But there was something else in her demeanor that made them pause. "Detective Johnson," Officer Rodriguez greeted her, his relief barely concealed. He'd worked with her on several cases and respected her judgment. Officer Walsh turned slightly, his hand still firmly on Marcus's shoulder. "Detective, this is a routine traffic stop. We have reason to believe this vehicle was reported stolen." Sarah approached slowly, her heart thundering in her chest even as she maintained her professional composure. "I'm familiar with this vehicle, Officer Walsh, and its owner." Her voice carried across the suddenly silent crowd. "In fact, I helped restore the interior myself." Walsh's expression flickered with confusion. "You know this suspect?" "Suspect?" Sarah's voice took on an edge that made Walsh's hand twitch. "That's my husband you have pressed against our car." The revelation rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Jenny Chen gasped audibly while her father placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Professor Richards adjusted her camera angle, capturing the dawning realization on Walsh's face. But Sarah wasn't finished. "If you'd run the plates properly, you'd have seen that this vehicle is registered to Marcus Johnson, who lives at 1242 Maple Drive, 4 blocks from here. The same Marcus Johnson who designed the new community center you patrol every day." Walsh's face reddened, but he held his ground. "We received a report of a similar vehicle." "A report from 2 counties over," Sarah interrupted, "of a 1967 Impala with significant body damage and a missing tail light." She gestured to the pristine vehicle. "Does this look like a car with body damage to you, Officer Walsh?" Richard Foster zoomed his camera in on the immaculate paint job, the perfectly maintained chrome, the complete absence of any damage. In his viewfinder, he could see Officer Rodriguez taking a step back from the scene, his discomfort now plainly visible. Professor Richards had moved closer, her live stream catching every word. The comment section of her feed was exploding with reactions, shares multiplying by the second. Local news stations were picking up the feed, and hashtags were already trending. Marcus remained still, his years of conditioning warning him that the situation wasn't over yet. He'd seen too many stories where things went wrong, even after the truth came out. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Pride can make a man dig his heels in deeper, son. Sometimes the hardest thing is letting someone back down gracefully." Thomas Chen stepped forward, the photo album clutched in Jenny's hands. "Officer," he said quietly, "every stage of this car's restoration is documented here. Mr. Johnson brings coffee to our store every morning. He mentors my daughter in mathematics. He is not just a resident of Pine Grove, he is part of its foundation." Other voices began to rise from the crowd, each adding their own testimony. A retired judge stepped forward to mention Marcus's work on the Historical Preservation Committee. A local teacher spoke up about his volunteer work with the STEM program. Each voice added another crack to the wall of assumptions Walsh had built. Detective Sarah Johnson watched her fellow officer carefully, recognizing the dangerous moment of decision. A man's pride, when wounded, could be more dangerous than his prejudice. She had seen good officers make bad choices simply because they couldn't admit they were wrong. Rodriguez, perhaps sensing the same thing, stepped forward. "Sir," he addressed Walsh, "I believe we should conclude our investigation. The evidence clearly shows—" "Evidence?" Walsh's voice had taken on a strange edge. "What about procedure, protocol? We can't just—" "James." Sarah's use of his first name cut through his protest. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do next." The moment hung in the air like a held breath. In the distance, more media vans were arriving, drawn by the viral live stream and the local news tips. Pine Grove's moment of truth was being documented in real time, and its resolution would either begin a healing process or deepen the wounds that had always existed beneath its polished surface. Marcus felt the pressure of Walsh's hand lessening on his shoulder, but he didn't move. He thought about Sarah, about how they'd met at a community police relations board meeting 3 years ago. They'd both been trying to build bridges in their own ways. She from within the system, he through his work and community involvement. Now those two worlds had collided on this street corner. Professor Richards' live stream captured the subtle shift in the crowd's energy as Officer Peterson's radio crackled to life. Dispatch was finally responding with the complete details of the stolen vehicle report. The description that came through bore little resemblance to Marcus's meticulously maintained Impala, aside from the model and year. Jenny Chen had opened the photo album, holding it up so the gathering news cameras could capture the progression of the car's restoration. There was Marcus and his father in the early photos, working on the engine. Later photos showed Sarah joining the project, the three of them covered in grease but smiling. The final photo showed Marcus and his father standing proudly beside the finished car, taken just weeks before the elder Johnson passed away. The weight of history, personal and societal, pressed down on this moment. Every person present understood that what happened next would define their community for years to come. The solution wasn't as simple as an apology or a handshake. It would require something more profound, a recognition of deeper truths that Pine Grove had long tried to ignore. Officer Walsh's hand finally dropped from Marcus's shoulder, but the tension in the air remained electric. The growing media presence had transformed this quiet suburban street into an impromptu stage where a drama of national significance was unfolding. Channel 4's van had just pulled up, and reporters were rushing to set up their equipment alongside Richard Foster's already rolling camera. Marcus slowly turned around, his movements still careful and deliberate. His eyes met Sarah's first, seeing the complex mixture of love, anger, and professional restraint in her expression. Then he looked at Walsh, really looked at him, and saw something unexpected. Fear. Not the kind of fear that came from facing a threat, but the fear of a man watching his entire worldview crack apart in public. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying in the hushed street, "would you like to see the engine? My father and I rebuilt it ourselves. Every part has a story." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline. Professor Richards' livestream comments exploded with reactions, some praising Marcus's grace, others angry at the very notion that he should have to extend such courtesy. But Marcus understood something deeper at play. His father had taught him that change rarely came from confrontation alone. Sarah recognized what her husband was doing. It was the same approach he'd used when they first met, when she'd admitted her own family's struggles with accepting their relationship. He had this way of turning moments of potential conflict into opportunities for connection. Walsh stood frozen for a moment, clearly struggling with the shift in dynamic. His training hadn't prepared him for this kind of situation. Finally, he managed to speak. I need to follow procedure and confirm." "The procedure's been followed, James," Sarah interrupted gently. "The dispatch report is clear. Now we have a choice about what happens next." Rodriguez stepped forward again, this time with more confidence. "Sir, I think Mr. Johnson is offering us an opportunity here. Maybe we should take it." Thomas Chen had moved closer, still holding the photo album. "Officer Walsh," he said, "in my country, when someone makes an effort to share their story with you, refusing to listen is considered a grave insult." The gathered crowd waited, watching this moment of decision. Professor Richards had stopped narrating her live stream, letting the raw footage speak for itself. Richard Foster's camera captured every subtle expression, every shift in body language, as Officer Walsh stood at his own personal crossroads. Finally, Walsh cleared his throat. "I'd like to see the engine, Mr. Johnson." Marcus nodded and moved toward the car's hood, his movements now relaxed but still mindful of the officers present. As he reached for the hood latch, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished black paint. Himself, Walsh, and Sarah, all visible in the gleaming surface. Three people whose lives had become unexpectedly intertwined on this night. The hood opened with a well-oiled smoothness that spoke of meticulous care. The engine compartment was immaculate, every component gleaming like jewelry. Marcus began to explain each part's history, where he and his father had found it, how they'd restored it, the lessons learned along the way. As he spoke, something subtle began to change in the atmosphere. Other officers drew closer, genuinely interested in the mechanical narrative. Jenny Chen started sharing photos from the album, pointing out the progression of the restoration. Even some of the reporters lowered their cameras, caught up in the story of a father and son's love transformed into mechanical art. Professor Richards continued her recording, but her academic analysis was being challenged by the scene unfolding before her. She'd documented countless confrontations between police and minorities. But This was evolving into something different, something that defied easy categorization. Sarah watched her husband carefully, recognizing the subtle references to his father in his story. Each part of the car was connected to a lesson about patience, about judgment, about the importance of looking deeper than surface appearances. She'd heard these stories during their own restoration work together, but now they carried new weight. Walsh's posture had gradually changed as Marcus spoke. The defensive rigidity was melting away, replaced by something more genuine. He asked questions about the engine, and each answer seemed to build a tiny bridge across the chasm that had separated them minutes earlier. But beneath this moment of connection, larger questions still loomed. Richard Foster's camera captured the faces in the crowd, hopeful but wary, encouraged but not yet convinced. They all understood that one positive interaction couldn't erase generations of bias and misunderstanding. Detective Johnson knew that tomorrow would bring questions from internal affairs, from the media, from community leaders. This incident would force Pine Grove to confront issues it had long ignored. Reports would need to be filed, statements made, policies examined. As Marcus continued his explanation of the engine's restoration, more residents arrived at the scene. Among them was Council Member Patricia Martinez, who had championed police reform measures that had been repeatedly tabled by the City Council. She stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, her presence a reminder that individual moments of understanding needed to be translated into systemic change. The night air had grown cooler, but nobody moved to leave. Something important was happening here, something that went beyond a simple misunderstanding about a car. In the gentle glow of streetlights and camera lights, against the backdrop of gathering media and growing crowd, a small but significant transformation was taking place. As Marcus closed the hood of the Impala, Councilmember Martinez stepped forward, her presence immediately drawing attention. She'd been taking notes on her phone, not just about the incident, but about the way the community had spontaneously come together. "Mr. Johnson," she addressed Marcus formally, "I believe this evening has demonstrated something my office has been trying to convey for months. Would you be willing to speak at next week's council meeting? We're discussing the community policing initiative, and I think your perspective would be valuable." Before Marcus could respond, Officer Walsh spoke up, surprising everyone. "I'd like to be there too, if that's appropriate." His voice carried a hint of uncertainty, but also determination. I think there are things we need to address openly." Sarah watched this exchange with professional interest. As a detective, she'd been pushing for changes in department training for years. This incident could be the catalyst needed to implement real reforms, but it would have to be handled carefully to avoid the typical defensiveness that often derailed such efforts. Professor Richards had shifted her live stream's focus to capture this development, but she noticed something equally significant happening at the edges of the crowd. Officer Rodriguez was engaged in a quiet conversation with Thomas Chen and several other community members. They were exchanging phone numbers, making plans for coffee meetings, discussing the formation of a community advisory board. Jenny Chen, still clutching the photo album, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Johnson helped me understand calculus by using car engines as examples. Maybe we could start a program where police officers and community members teach each other about their worlds." The suggestion, coming from a teenager, carried a wisdom that made the adults pause. Richard Foster zoomed his camera in on Jenny's earnest face, capturing what would become one of the most powerful images of the evening. Marcus leaned back against his car, feeling its familiar contours. "My father always said that this car was more than just transportation. It was a conversation piece. He believed that when people gather around something they can share, real understanding becomes possible." He looked at Officer Walsh. "I think he'd be proud to see his theory proven right tonight." Walsh nodded slowly, then reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Walsh. You can cancel any outstanding alerts on this vehicle, and I'd like to report that I need to file an incident review for an unnecessary stop." The admission cost him visibly, but the impact was immediate. Several other officers straightened up, recognizing the significance of a fellow officer voluntarily acknowledging a mistake. Sarah felt a surge of professional respect for Walsh's courage in that moment. Councilmember Martinez was already typing on her phone. "I'm drafting a proposal for an emergency council session. We need to strike while this momentum exists." She looked up at the gathering. "Would all of you be willing to attend? to share what you've witnessed here?" The crowd's response was immediate and affirmative. Professor Richards finally lowered her phone, stopping her live stream to step forward. "I'd like to offer my department's resources for training workshops. We have research and methodologies that could help structure these community dialogues." As the discussion continued, Marcus felt Sarah's hand slip into his. They shared a look that contained volumes: pride, worry, hope, determination. They both knew that this night was just the beginning. Real change would require sustained effort from everyone present. Thomas Chen had reopened his store, and people were gradually moving inside, turning the impromptu gathering into something more organized. The news crews were setting up for live broadcasts, but the story had evolved far beyond the initial incident. They were now documenting the birth of something new in Pine Grove. Officer Rodriguez had retrieved notepads from his patrol car, and people were forming small groups, writing down ideas, exchanging contact information. The energy had transformed from tension to purpose, from confrontation to collaboration. Walsh stood somewhat apart, watching this transformation with a mixture of emotions playing across his face. Marcus noticed and walked over to him, Sarah following close behind. "Officer Walsh," Marcus said quietly, "my father also taught me that the hardest step in any journey is the first one. What matters isn't where we start, but our willingness to move forward." Walsh met Marcus's eyes, then Sarah's. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of understanding. The real work, they all knew, was still ahead. The night deepened around Pine Grove, but the lights in Thomas Chen's store burned bright as the impromptu community meeting continued. Outside, Marcus's Impala gleamed under the streetlights, a silent witness to the evening's events. In its polished surface, the reflections of police officers and civilians mingled together, indistinguishable in the soft light, as new conversations began to take shape. Inside Chen's store, the fluorescent lights illuminated a scene that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. The usually tidy aisles had been transformed into a makeshift community center, with people sitting on whatever makeshift seats they could find. Milk crates, stacked boxes, and the few chairs from Chen's small coffee counter. Detective Sarah Johnson had taken up position near the register, her detective's notebook open as she facilitated what had organically evolved into a community action meeting. The expertise she'd gained from years of community policing was proving invaluable as she helped structure the raw energy of the gathering into actionable plans. "We need to be strategic about this," Councilmember Martinez was saying, standing beside a hastily created whiteboard that Jenny Chen had brought from her study area in the store's back room. "The momentum we have right now is powerful, but we've seen movements like this fizzle out before." Marcus sat quietly, observing the scene while absently turning his car keys over in his hands. The weight of the evening's events was starting to settle on him, bringing with it a mix of exhaustion and cautious hope. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Change is like rebuilding an engine, son. You can't rush it, can't skip steps, and you need the right tools for the job." Officer Walsh had positioned himself near the door, his posture still rigid but his expression thoughtful, as he watched his fellow officers, Rodriguez and Peterson, actively engaging with community members. He'd removed his hat, making him look somehow more human, more approachable. Every now and then, his hand would drift to his radio, as if reassuring himself it was still there. Professor Richards had set up her laptop on a stack of empty boxes and was sharing real-time statistics from similar community initiatives across the country. "The key," she explained, pointing to her screen, "is maintaining engagement after the initial catalyst. We need structured programs, regular meetings, and most importantly, measurable goals." Thomas Chin moved through the crowd with a pot of coffee, filling paper cups and offering them to everyone present. When he reached Walsh, he paused. "In my culture," he said softly, "sharing tea, or in this case, coffee, is a way of saying we are all equal in this moment." Walsh accepted the cup with a nod, understanding the significance of the gesture. Jenny had begun creating a spreadsheet on her tablet, listing everyone's contact information and their committed contributions to the initiative. "Mr. Johnson," she called out, "would you be willing to lead the mechanical workshop program we discussed? We could use the community center's garage space." Before Marcus could respond, Walsh cleared his throat. I know some mechanics too. My grandfather taught me. Maybe we could co-lead it?" The offer hung in the air for a moment, its significance not lost on anyone present. Sarah watched her husband's face carefully as he considered the proposal. She knew that accepting would mean more than just teaching mechanics. It would be a very public statement, a commitment to building bridges that some might not want built. Marcus stood up slowly, all eyes turning to him. "On one condition," he said, addressing Walsh directly. "We make it about more than just cars. We use it as a space to have the hard conversations too. The ones about assumptions, about fear, about trust." The local news crews, who had been filming through the store's windows, pressed closer as Walsh stepped forward to shake Marcus's hand. Richard Foster's camera captured the moment in perfect focus. The black architectural engineer and the white police officer, illuminated by fluorescent lights in a Korean immigrant store, surrounded by their community. Councilmember Martinez was already adding this to her proposal. "We can build on this. Create similar programs in other areas. Cooking classes, sports programs, neighborhood watch partnerships. The key is creating spaces where we see each other as people first, where we can't hide behind our uniforms or assumptions." Professor Richards's live stream comments were flooding in with offers of support from neighboring communities, questions about how to implement similar programs, and messages of hope from around the country. The night's events had struck a chord that resonated far beyond Pine Grove's borders. Sarah stepped forward, her detective's insight cutting to the heart of the matter. "What happened tonight was wrong," she stated clearly, looking at Walsh, who met her gaze steadily. "But how we respond to it, that's what will define us. We have a chance to turn this mistake into a movement." The conversation continued late into the night, with new people arriving as word spread through social media and local news coverage. Plans were made, committees formed, and promises exchanged. But beneath the practical logistics, something more profound was taking shape, a reimagining of what community could mean. Outside, Marcus's Impala sat under the streetlights, its reflection in the store windows a reminder of how the evening had begun. But now, instead of being a source of suspicion, it had become a symbol of possibility, a catalyst for change that no one had seen coming. The digital clock on Chen's wall ticked past midnight, but no one seemed eager to leave. There was still so much to discuss, so many bridges to build, and the night felt somehow safer with all of them together, working towards something larger than themselves. Around 1 a.m., Sarah noticed Marcus stifling a yawn. The adrenaline that had carried them through the earlier confrontation was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. But even as people began to show signs of fatigue, there was a reluctance to disperse, as if leaving might break the spell of unity that had settled over the gathering. Councilmember Martinez was the first to recognize the need for closure. "We should continue this tomorrow," she suggested, checking her phone. "I've secured the community center's main hall for 6 p.m. That gives us time to spread the word and bring in more voices." As people began to gather their belongings, Officer Walsh approached Marcus one more time. The awkwardness from earlier hadn't fully dissipated, but it had transformed into something more contemplative. "Mr. Johnson," he began, then corrected himself. "Marcus, I've been thinking about what you said about your father's lessons. Would you tell me more about him? Maybe over coffee sometime." The request carried weight beyond its simple words. Marcus glanced at Sarah, who gave him a subtle nod. "How about tomorrow morning?" he suggested. "Chen's store, 7 a.m. We can talk before the community meeting." Professor Richards, overhearing this exchange, quietly closed her laptop. Her academic research had documented countless incidents of racial profiling, but rarely had she witnessed such an immediate attempt at genuine reconciliation. She made a mental note to adjust her upcoming thesis to include this case study. Jenny Chen was still at her makeshift desk, finalizing the contact list and action items. "Dad," she called out to Thomas, "can we use the store as a regular meeting place? Maybe set up a proper community board here?" Thomas Chen looked around his store, seeing it with new eyes. What had started as a simple convenience store had become something more tonight. A neutral ground where barriers could come down and real conversations could happen. "Yes," he decided. "We'll make space." As people began to file out, Rodriguez helped Chen and Jenny stack chairs and move boxes back into place. The young officer had been quiet for the past hour, absorbing everything. Now, as he worked, he shared his own story with them, about growing up in a neighborhood where police were seen as threats, not protectors, and how that had motivated him to join the force and try to make changes from within. Sarah watched the interactions with professional interest, but also with personal investment. As both a detective and a black woman married to a black man, she straddled multiple perspectives in this situation. She knew tomorrow would bring scrutiny from her superiors, questions about her handling of the situation, perhaps even accusations of failing to maintain professional distance. But watching her husband talk quietly with Walsh, she knew she'd made the right choices. Outside, the media presence had thinned, but Richard Foster remained, capturing the moment as people emerged from the store. His years of experience told him this story wasn't over. It was just beginning. He'd already arranged to follow up with several key participants over the coming weeks. Marcus and Sarah were among the last to leave. As they walked toward the Impala, Officer Walsh called out one last time, "Johnson!" They both turned. Walsh seemed to struggle with his words for a moment before continuing. I'm sorry. About earlier. It's not enough, I know, but it's a start." Marcus nodded, understanding the courage it took to make such an admission. "Tomorrow morning, Officer Walsh, 7 a.m. As they drove home through the quiet streets of Pine Grove, Sarah reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand. Neither spoke for a while, processing the events of the night. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Your dad would be proud, you know, not just of how you handled it, but of what you're building from it." Marcus thought about the coffee meeting tomorrow morning, about the community gathering in the evening, about all the work that lay ahead. "He always said every breakdown is a chance for a rebuild," he mused. "I don't think this is quite what he meant, but the principle holds." Their headlights illuminated empty streets as they drove, but the darkness felt different now, less threatening, more full of possibility. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, media interviews to navigate, department politics to handle, community expectations to manage. But something had shifted in Pine Grove tonight, something that couldn't be undone. The digital clock on the Impala's restored dashboard clicked over to 1:30 a.m. as they turned onto their street. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a changed community, and the real work would begin. The alarm went off at 6 a.m., though Marcus had barely slept. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his collar and thinking about the day ahead. Sarah appeared behind him, already in her detective's uniform. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, watching his reflection. "No one would blame you if you decided it was too much." Marcus shook his head. "Dad always said that when an engine seizes up, you have two choices. You can junk it, or you can rebuild it better than before. We've got a seized engine here, Sarah. Time to rebuild." The early morning air was crisp as Marcus pulled the Impala into Chen's store parking lot at 6:55 a.m. He was surprised to find he wasn't the first one there. Thomas Chen was already setting up chairs in a corner of the store, having cleared some shelf space to create a small seating area. Jenny was there too, arranging fresh pastries from the Korean bakery across town. "Mrs. Park donated these when she heard what happened," Jenny explained, gesturing to the pastries. "She said her son had a similar experience last year in the next county over. She wants to come to the community meeting tonight." At exactly 7 a.m., Officer Walsh arrived. He was in civilian clothes, a simple button-down shirt and slacks, but his police cruiser was visible in the parking lot. He entered the store with the cautious steps of someone entering unfamiliar territory. Marcus gestured to one of the chairs Chen had arranged. On the small table between them, Jenny had placed 2 cups of coffee and some of Mrs. Park's pastries. For a moment, neither man spoke, the weight of last night's events hanging between them. "My father was a mechanic," Marcus finally began, breaking the silence. "But he was really a teacher who used cars as his classroom. Every repair was a lesson about life." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "The night you stopped me, I was thinking about him, about how proud he'd be of the car's restoration, about how far I've come from the garage where he taught me." Walsh listened, his coffee untouched. Thomas Chen busied himself behind the counter, pretending not to listen, while Jenny made no such pretense, openly watching from her homework corner. "I've been on the force 12 years, Walsh finally said, his voice quiet. "Did all the training, followed all the procedures. But last night," he struggled with the words, "last night showed me that maybe the procedures themselves are part of the problem." Outside, the morning traffic was picking up as Pine Grove began to wake. Through the store windows, they could see other cars pulling into the parking lot. Professor Richards with her laptop, Rodriguez in his civilian clothes, Council Member Martinez carrying folders of documents. "I'm not here to absolve you," Marcus said clearly, meeting Walsh's eyes. "That's not my job. But I am here to work with you, to help make sure what happened last night doesn't happen to someone else's son, someone else's husband." Walsh nodded slowly. "When I was growing up, my grandfather had a '65 Mustang," he offered. "Taught me everything I know about cars. It was the only time I really felt close to him. When you opened that hood last night," he paused. "It reminded me of those moments." More people were filtering into the store now. Richard Foster had arrived with his camera, documenting this early morning meeting. Sarah pulled up in her unmarked car, choosing to observe from outside, giving her husband and her colleague the space to navigate this crucial conversation. "Maybe that's where we start," Marcus suggested. "Not with policies or procedures, but with stories, with understanding what shaped us, what drives us." He gestured to the gathering crowd. "All of us." Thomas Chen emerged from behind his counter with more coffee and chairs. The small seating area began to expand as others joined the conversation. Professor Richards set up her laptop, ready to document this continuation of last night's momentum. Council Member Martinez spread out her proposals on an improvised table made from empty boxes. The morning sun streamed through the store windows, illuminating this unlikely gathering. Police officers and civilians, community leaders and store owners, all drawn together by an incident that could have torn them apart, but was instead building something new. Outside, Marcus's Impala gleamed in the early light, no longer a symbol of suspicion, but a bridge between different worlds, different experiences, different understandings. The day ahead would bring challenges. The community meeting, media inquiries, departmental reviews. But in this moment, in the quiet of early morning, something profound was taking root in Pine Grove. The bell above Chen's store door chimed again as more people arrived, each bringing their own story, their own perspective, their own hope for change. The simple coffee meeting was evolving into something larger, something that felt like the beginning of a real transformation. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the renovated garage of the Pine Grove Community Center, surrounded by the sounds of tools clanking and voices calling out mechanical questions. The Bridges and Engines program, as they'd come to call it, had grown far beyond his and Walsh's initial vision. Tonight was graduation night for their first class of participants, an unlikely mix of police officers, teenagers, retirees, and community members who'd spent the past months learning not just about car maintenance, but about each other's lives. The restored '67 Impala sat in the center of the garage, still serving as both teaching tool and conversation starter. Officer Walsh, now Sergeant Walsh following his promotion to Community Relations Supervisor, was helping a young black teenager diagnose an engine problem. Their easy rapport would have seemed impossible half a year ago. Walsh had transformed his initial mistake into a mission, becoming one of the department's strongest advocates for reform. Sarah watched from the doorway, her detective's badge catching the light. The department had implemented many of her suggested changes to training and procedure, using the incident with Marcus as a case study in both what to avoid and how to make things right. She'd recently been appointed to lead a new division focused on community-oriented policing. Professor Richards stood at her usual spot by the wall, documenting everything. Her paper on the Pine Grove model had gained national attention, with other communities reaching out to learn from their experience. But more importantly, the real-time data showed a significant decrease in biased incidents and an increase in community trust. Thomas Chen had expanded his store's community space, which now served as an unofficial headquarters for various neighborhood initiatives. Jenny, now in her senior year, was preparing to study social justice and law enforcement policy in college, inspired by the changes she'd witnessed. Councilmember Martinez had successfully pushed through comprehensive reforms, using the momentum from that night to build lasting change. The sight of police officers and civilians working together on cars, sharing meals, and engaging in honest dialogue had become commonplace in Pine Grove. As Marcus prepared to address the graduating class, he felt his father's presence strongly. The framed photo of them working on the Impala hung on the garage wall, alongside pictures documenting the community's transformation over the past 6 months. His father's lessons about patience, understanding, and the healing power of shared purpose had proven prophetic. When my father taught me about cars, Marcus began, the room falling quiet. He always said that every machine has a breaking point, but also a point of renewal. 6 months ago, our community reached both those points in a single night. We could have broken apart. Instead, we chose to rebuild. Walsh stood beside him now, their shoulder-to-shoulder stance a testament to how far things had come. What started with a mistake, Walsh added, became a mission. Every person in this room has been part of that mission, proving that change is possible when we're brave enough to face our biases and humble enough to learn from each other. The assembled crowd represented a cross-section of Pine Grove's transformed community. Richard Foster was there too, filming the graduation for a documentary about community policing reform. His footage from that first night had become a teaching tool in police academies across the country. As certificates were handed out and stories shared, Marcus slipped away to stand beside his car. Running his hand along its polished surface, he smiled at the reflection of the diverse group of people who now called each other friends, mentors, and allies. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Sometimes the best repairs aren't about fixing what's broken, but about building something better in its place. Sarah joined him, intertwining her fingers with his. "Your dad was right," she said softly, "about everything." The evening concluded with a community dinner in the center's main hall, where Mrs. Park's Korean fusion restaurant now regularly catered events. As Marcus looked around at the laughing, talking crowd, officers and civilians, young and old, every race and background represented, he realized that his father's old Impala had fulfilled its destiny. It hadn't just been restored, it had helped restore a community. Pine Grove had become a model for other cities, proving that one moment of crisis, handled with grace and determination, could catalyze real change. The work wasn't finished. It never would be. But they had built something unique, a community where understanding was valued above assumptions, where bridges were stronger than barriers, and where every breakdown was seen as an opportunity to rebuild something better. As the evening wound down, Marcus and Sarah headed home in the Impala, its engine purring smoothly through the streets of their transformed town. In the rearview mirror, they could see the lights of the community center glowing warmly, a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. The car that had once been a source of suspicion now carried a different story, one of redemption, renewal, and the endless possibility of positive change.